This video serves as an introduction to our Bible study on the book of 1 Corinthians. And in this video, I plan on discussing the necessary context for understanding the book, or that's helpful to understand the book. It's an occasional letter, meaning there's a situation within the Church of Corinth that occasions the writing of this epistle, and it's helpful to know a little bit about what those occasions might have been. We have to speculate a little bit because we don't know for sure, and we'll get into the reasons why we don't know for sure, but I think it's helpful to think about, one, the immediate context, but also the nature of the city itself, what Corinth was like as a city, what its people were like, what life was like in Corinth, because that helps to understand the book as well. Okay, so the Apostle Paul is the author of the book of 1 Corinthians, and really he needs no introduction for us because he's well known to us as Christians, at least the kind of basic details of his life, his conversion on the road to Damascus, in which he went from being a notorious persecutor of the church to one of its most stalwart apostles, alongside Peter, one of the princes of the apostles of the church. And from Acts chapter 18, we learn that while Paul was on his second missionary journey, he planted the church in Corinth in AD 50. And as was his custom, he went first to the synagogue to preach to the Jews, to try to convert the Jews, and he was unsuccessful there, basically unsuccessful. He made a few converts, but not many. So he turned then his focus of attention to the Gentiles of the city. And he spent a year and a half in Corinth laboring in the ministry of the gospel there. 1 Corinthians is written around the year AD 55, and there's a lot that transpires between Paul and the Corinthian church in the 2 to 3 years in which he had left the city, left the church of Corinth, and when he writes it in AD 55. But we'll return to that in a few minutes. What do we know about the city of Corinth and its people? Corinth was a port city located at the narrow neck that joins the Peloponnese Peninsula to mainland Greece. Originally, it was a Greek city-state that thrived both before and after the golden age of Athens in the 5th century BC. But in the mid-2nd century BC, it was the leader of the Achaean League and came into conflict with the city of Rome. And in that conflict, Rome sacked the city, destroyed it in 146 BC, and then around 100 years later, in 44, it's refounded by Julius Caesar as a Roman colony. And it was strategically located for commerce, was known to be a place of potential socio-economic advancement, and was a meeting place of both West and East. As such, it was demographically diverse. There were Romans there were Greeks there were Jews there, and everything from an aristocracy of the wealthy to artisans and merchants and lots of slaves. It was very much a metropolitan city. The Romans were dominant, but Corinth was Hellenized through and through. The common language was Greek, and Greek aspects like the arts and philosophy and religion played a significant part in the cultural matrix of the city. So, for instance, the Isthmian Games, second only to the Olympic Games, were held at Corinth. And like with all major metropolitan cities, it came with its socioeconomic advantages and vices and corruptions. The ancient Greek historian Aristophanes tells us that Corinth was known especially for its libertinism. To Corinthianize, to act like a Corinthian, meant to commit fornication. There was a temple, the Temple of Aphrodite, on the Acrocorinth, well known for its temple prostitutes. So we might think of Corinth as a combination of Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And as we'll see in our study of 1 Corinthians, the Corinthian church is not free from these cultural influences. What do we know about the church of Corinth? Much of this has to be inferred from the sorts of things that Paul says in his 2 letters to the Corinthians found in the New Testament and reconstructed on that basis. As I said earlier, there's a fair amount that transpires between Paul and the Corinthian church between 51 or 52, when he originally leaves the church of Corinth, and 55 when he writes 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is an occasional or situational letter, like much of the New Testament, in fact. There's a situation within the church that forces his hands, so to speak, that causes him to write the letter to address what's on his heart and mind. And we know that there's about 10 or so issues in the book of 1 Corinthians that are on Paul's heart and mind. Most of them are behavioral or have to do with Christian conduct in this life, but only one of which is theological as such, namely the bodily resurrection, the reality of the bodily resurrection. And we know too that Paul has already written to them once. So we have Paul's writing to them and their response to him, but both of those have been lost to us, lost to history. So all we have is 1 and 2 Corinthians. So it's kind of difficult to reconstruct what exactly is going on, what the background is here, but we're going to try in this video. So it seems like, well, it's more than seems. There's clearly a conflict within the church, conflict that has caused division. This conflict is not just horizontal. It doesn't just exist among the members of the church, but it's also vertical. It exists between a certain faction of Corinthian Christians that have influence within the church and Paul himself. And there's an unwillingness among these people to recognize Paul, to recognize his authority. And as I said earlier, we know that Paul's already written to them. We don't know exactly what occasioned that letter, but it had something to do with sexual immorality. There were people within the church that were flagrantly committing sexual immorality, and apparently others within the church didn't think it was that big of a deal. And because of the close connection in the city of Corinth between sexual immorality and idolatry, and because of Paul's linking those two issues or addressing those two issues in 1 Corinthians as well, it's likely that that issue was on his heart and mind in that last letter as well. And evidently the Corinthians have disregarded or misunderstood what Paul has written previously, so he feels the need to write back to them. And as I said, they've written their own response to his letter, and we know from the last chapter of 1 Corinthians that this response has been carried by Stephanas, and Stephanas has helped to fill out the context there by explaining his own understanding of the situation. And we gather from how Paul responds in 1 Corinthians that he has what we might call a crisis of antagonists within the Corinthian church on his hand. There's an anti-Pauline faction within the church that is opposed to him on almost every front, that is undermining his authority and that is influencing the majority of the church. And this faction of antagonists accuses Paul of not being spiritual or a prophet. So how did this situation develop? It's hard to say, but evidently Apollos had something to do with it. We know from Acts chapter 18 that Apollos was known to be an eloquent man and knowledgeable in the scriptures. Evidently, this guy could really preach and really teach. We know, too, that he came to minister to the Corinthian Christians sometime after Paul had planted the church and that he had gained a following. And in the minds of some of these Corinthian Christians, his preaching and teaching was associated with true spiritual wisdom and knowledge. And apparently, in comparison with Apollos, Paul was not quite as gifted in his preaching and teaching, at least in the minds of this anti-Pauline faction. I think immediately of that story in the book of Acts. I forget what chapter it is, but remember, Paul is preaching for quite a while, and there's that young man that's sitting on the windowsill and he falls asleep. So that maybe provides some insight into Paul's preaching there. But Paul was preaching in the minds of these people milk for babes, and they had moved on to food for the mature. He also didn't have the rhetorical skills that they thought needed to accompany spiritual wisdom. That's actually, I think that's unfair. If you're attentive to what happens in 1 Corinthians or other places in the New Testament, Paul was certainly gifted in the art of rhetoric, which was in the ancient world very highly esteemed. But Apollos, as we know, was from Alexandria, trained in Alexandria. That's like the Oxford or Cambridge of the ancient world. So that guy probably was top-notch. So in comparison to Apollos, in the minds of this anti-Pauline faction, Paul doesn't add up. But we know, too, that this rift between the people, this faction, this anti-Pauline faction in Corinth and Paul, it doesn't, and their commitment to Apollos doesn't actually affect Paul and Apollos. I should say, there's no actual evidence of a rift between Paul and Apollos themselves. They seem to have been on good terms, and we know that from the book of 1 Corinthians. So what is the point of contention? What are they arguing about? The dispute between the anti-Pauline faction and Paul is essentially over what it means to be spiritual or to be people of the Holy Spirit. They are sure that they are spiritual, but they're not so sure about Paul. They've experienced the spirit of inspiration, of wisdom, and of knowledge, and this is especially manifested through their own overemphasis on the gift of tongues. That comes up clearly later in the book of 1 Corinthians. They've also been influenced by Hellenistic philosophy, the philosophy of dualism, that there's a sharp divide between matter and spirit, or between body and soul, and that what is done in the body has no import for the life of the soul, for the life of the spirit. That's why there's some in the Church of Corinth that deny the resurrection of the body. And it's also why some are encouraging sexual immorality, and others are denying the good of sexual intimacy within marriage. So there's two of these opposite extremes regarding what to do in the body, specifically with regard to sexual intercourse. And they're at odds with each other, obviously, in one way. They're polar opposites, but they also reflect the same animating principle of the denial of the goodness of the body. Okay, here's a brief outline of the book of 1 Corinthians. So chapters 1 through 4 addresses divisions in the church. Chapters 5 through 7, immorality in the church, specifically sexual immorality, but also lawsuits. Chapters 8 through 11, food, specifically meat offered to idols, but also the Eucharist, and there is a tangent there on head coverings that we'll talk about as well. Chapters 12 through 14, spiritual gifts, especially speaking in tongues and prophecy. Chapter 15 is on the resurrection, and chapter 16 deals with the collection among the churches, but also the Christians there, but also just some plans that Paul has about traveling and such. So that's the basic overview, and this is our introduction again to the book of 1 Corinthians. Next time we'll take up chapter 1.